With Bethesda's Starfield set to release in 2023, we are all eagerly waiting for the promises of Bethesda to come through and for Starfield to be a massive success. One of the things that Starfield must contain is having a really good combat focus, which we've started to see with some of the screenshots and videos that's come out with kind of like the different loadouts and customization that you can have in your weapons. We want obviously the combat in Starfield to feel good. Traditionally, Bethesda games have been decent for combat, and I think with Fallout 4 we didn't see awful combat, but I would like to see it kind of developed a bit more. I want to see more combinations of stuff that we can add to our weapons. Likewise, I want to see interesting perks that are used in unique ways. I want to be able to have like stealth weapons, the silencers. I want all this stuff in from the combat of Starfield. I'm really hoping that they do well. There's only one thing that Mass Effect Andromeda did well, or two things. The graphics of Mass Effect Andromeda were good, and secondly, the combat in Mass Effect Andromeda was actually pretty good. You had those abilities that you could use, the weapons felt good, the sounds were good, and just in general the combat in Mass Effect Andromeda felt really good. And so whilst it may not have been the best RPG and the story wasn't amazing and the characters weren't great, irrespective of all that, and that's hopefully all the things we're going to of course as well see in Starfield, I really would love to see an RPG that also has a good combat focus, because a lot of these really good RPGs the combat just isn't there, which is fine, but if we're going to be in combat, which to be honest I'm not super compelled to fight all the time, I'm not one of those players, but when we are in a fight, I want it to be a good, compelling fight, and I want it to last a few minutes. I don't want the opposition NPCs to just be health sponges and it's like one opponent or two opponents. I want to see a wide array of different characters that I'm fighting, and I want them to have abilities or some way to like engage me in different ways than just shooting me, and again different weapons and stuff. I think it will make for an engaging NPC experience. One of the other things that I think is really important for Starfield, and they seem to be nailing really well, is dialogue. Now, not only dialogue, it needs to be engaging. So what we do know from Starfield is that it's going to have 250,000 lines of dialogue. Now, what does that exactly mean? In Fallout 4, even with your main protagonist voiced, it was 100,000. But in Starfield, it's going to be 250,000, and that's without a voiced protagonist. And so the actual amount of NPCs that you can talk to probably is like 3 times more than we had in Fallout 4. And so we know that the breadth of engaging dialogue is going to be there, and that there's going to be a lot of different dialogue trees that you can go down. And we've seen some screenshots and basically videos that were essentially screenshots, as 1 second of video. And they shown the dialogue tree, and it does look like it's going to potentially be good. And I'm just really hoping that they really nail down on that and get it right. From what they seem to have said, even though there is like 3 times more dialogue, essentially what that's gone into is there's the same amount of quests as prior Bethesda games, but within each of these quests, there's going to be more dialogue options, more ways to talk to these NPCs. And so that's where a lot of this extra dialogue's going. It's not necessarily going to be that there's, 3 times as many quests as before. Again, it's simply that there's a lot more dialogue options and longer dialogue, which I think a lot of people want. But again, it does have to be engaging and compelling, which I think obviously it's going to be voice actors, so it should be fine in that regard as well. I wouldn't expect anything less. I don't think anyone else would either. In regards to dialogue as well, I do quickly want to say the facial animations are the same as the ones that we've had in prior Bethesda games, which some people aren't a massive fan of, and I would say I would rather it, the facial animations be a bit better. But is it something that I want the devs to focus on? If it was way better, that would be great, but it does take a lot of time to implement that kind of stuff, and with their game engine that they've got, of course there's limitations, and I think that facial animations definitely seems to be one of them. If they could fix it easily, they probably would have. The next one I did quickly want to touch on here is having expansive character creation. I definitely like in RPGs to have different like flavors of characters. So sometimes I'll create like a dude that's like old, and I come up with some headcanon behind his story, and really enjoy that RPG experience of like thinking, what would my character do? Not necessarily what I want to do, but what would my character do? And that's part of what makes RPGs great. And, part of delivering on that personally is going to be having a good character customization to create, to a decent degree, the kind of character that I'd like to see. A lot of the characters these days are character creators these days are pretty good. It's not necessarily indicative of a good game, to be fair as well, because you will see games like there was the recent Saints Row 4 that came out. That game was a flop. It was terrible in every regard except for the character customization. You could make your character look like any video game character or movie icon or whatever from any series, and you could do it pretty well. But irrespective of that, the actual gameplay and the story, of course, was not that good in Saints Row 4, so it was a bit of a flop. Now, the last feature that I want to talk about within Starfield that I think is the most important is that the feel of the game, and that it feels like an RPG and it feels good to play, for me is important. When things don't make sense that much, like in Cyberpunk, when you're playing the game as an RPG, it's a bit unimmersive. So I'll give a good example here. When you're fighting the police or whatever you want to call them within Cyberpunk, the enforcers, I don't know what they call them, I remember them always teleporting around, and they were just not fun to fight. They weren't engaging enemies. But then we compare that to something like what we saw in Skyrim, stop criminals, scum, and all those lines. I actually thought that the way in which Skyrim and kind of Fallout as well handles those police interactions and stuff is a lot more immersive. Because I always thought that pausing the game to have a dialogue tree where you can submit or not submit wasn't super immersive. But then I compare that to Cyberpunk, and so after seeing Cyberpunk, I'm like, man, they didn't actually do that bad of a job with prior Bethesda games, and the way that you would get caught doing something. It wasn't actually that bad. The stealth mechanics and all that also made sense, which all just made the immersion of the game a lot better. Now, the last thing that I'm personally looking forward to within Starfield is I like to explore every nook and cranny. Irrespective of if there's a quest there, I just want to go talk to NPCs and stuff. And I'm hoping that basically the world design within Starfield is good. So I want to see these cities have some random people that you can run into, that some beggar on the street and he has a cool story, maybe a side quest. That kind of stuff for me I think feels good and I enjoy it. And separately as well, just taking in the general atmosphere and really like this is something I don't think a lot of people really do in video games, and it sounds kind of weird, but just appreciating aesthetically the way in which the game's designed I think is pretty cool. I've always enjoyed doing it. I like looking at this cool scenery that they've added in. For me personally, it's something I've always enjoyed. I would also be interested in hearing what is everyone else looking forward to within Starfield. What are you looking forward to the most? What do you hope that they get right, that you're maybe a bit concerned they might not do right? Feel free to leave that stuff in the comment section. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already, because subscribing helps a bunch, and I only talk about RPG games that are actually good RPG games anyway, so you may as well. Have a wonderful week. I'm out. GG. Bye bye.